Hi, welcome to Explorations in Economic History. And this is an extra session on war communism to specifically discuss the lessons that leaders came away with. And a good part of this is based on my book, Rediscovering Fire. So you can always look to that book to learn a little bit more. So, about the war communist period, Trotsky wrote in 1936 that even if there had been revolution around the world in places such as Germany, he said it can be said with certainty it would still have been necessary to renounce direct state distribution of products, in other words, planning, in favor of methods of commerce or markets. So even if there had been revolution around the world, he realized that it was a mistake to try to attempt central planning right away. So as Lenin said, we made the mistake of deciding to go over directly to communist production and distribution. So they admitted that it was a mistake to immediately attempt to plan the economy. However, Lenin argued, and this is from, I think, 1919, Lenin argued that you can learn from your mistakes. Just because they admit a mistake, it doesn't mean that they can never attempt again to approach things the same way. So, in other words, even if there are problems with central planning that they ran into, serious problems, it doesn't mean that central planning can't work. As Lenin said, the whole point is that we have yet to learn the art of approach. There were glaring mistakes in the plans, but the efficient economist, instead of penning empty theses, will get down to a study of facts and figures, analyze the practical experience, pinpoint mistakes, and suggest a remedy. So keeping in mind Lenin's point that you can learn from your mistakes, it is amazing to see how Austrian predictions about the socialist economy were echoed in the quotes by the Soviet leaders and planners and by the sympathetic witnesses. So Mises said that that a socialist management of production, planners wouldn't know whether their plans were efficient, and planners would operate in the dark, as it were. Now, Barbara Wooten, who is the sympathetic observer, during the 1930s wrote about how the Supreme Economic Council had to make guesses in the dark. For the exact same reason. They were speaking about the same thing, and they happened to use the exact same words to describe what it was like for Soviet planners. And even more specifically, Mises, again speaking about this essentially the same problem, used the railroads as an example. And Mises said, picture the building of a new railroad. Should it be built at all? And if so, which out of a number of conceivable roads should be built? And so on and so forth. Now, Trotsky in the 1930s, but speaking about the war communism period, used the same example because it was something they had actually had this problem at the time, specifically the problem with railways. And Trotsky said that by following a plan, they ran the risk of losing all control over, or all information about, what was necessary and what was not, what was profitable and what was not. He even termed, because of course he's thinking about costs and benefits. And he said which line should be expanded and which one contracted. They had none of this information. And he concluded by saying only by maintaining a profit and loss balance between the various sectors of the railway network, and coupled with the same sort of balance among other branches of the economy, so that they would have prices to work with, looking at their inputs and making comparisons, and so on and so forth. Now, Trotsky did say that it was only for the time being that they would need this, but you have to sort of see it as the only reason that it would only be for the time being is because he had faith that eventually they would learn, or would be able to overcome this problem, maybe after human nature had changed, and so on. And what were some of the other lessons learned? Well, one thing that they learned was that setting all wages to the level of the ordinary workman, which they spoke about and took to be very important, well, it resulted in a lack of skilled labor, as people didn't bother to gain skills because they wouldn't be paid more for it. and also the inability to induce workers into the areas of the economy where they were needed, because differential wages, as a natural mechanism through the profit and loss mechanism, normally pulls workers into the areas where they're needed. So they're more enticed to work in that area for a higher wage, even though they slightly, don't enjoy it as much. They're willing to do it for a higher wage. Or if a certain area is flooded with workers, the wage falls and people go elsewhere. Another lesson that they learned is the difficulty of maintaining democracy under conditions of having to plan the economy and having to stick to a specific plan. So one thing they learned was that democracy within the state enterprises was more difficult than they thought, and they were forced to introduce one-man management in order to have greater efficiency. And also they learned that it was difficult to plan the economy and take into account what individuals wanted through voting and through factory councils and so on, and still be able to bring together all the different parts of the plan and produce the different things that were required based on the needs of other parts of the plan, if they also were going to take into account the voting at the bottom level. So this was all a lot more difficult than they had expected. So a quick reminder before we look at the lessons that Soviet leaders learned about the financial system and money and banks. Let's remember what they were intending to do with banks when they socialized the economy. What Lenin had argued before coming to power, and what they did intend to do, was to first nationalize all the banks and then actually transform them from banks working using interest and privately making individual loans to a system where the banks were in fact a key part of the plan, where they were used first to finance only what was in the plan, to ensure that the plan was the only factor for all production as well as distribution in the economy, and then to slowly phase out the actual use of money. So the bank would first become a central bookkeeping department, and then it would help lead to the abolition of money altogether. And the party and the Soviet government, in fact, took many steps towards this end in those first few years. So Gregory Zinoviev, who is of course a member of the Central Committee and very high up in leadership, and might have been in charge as the party leader at some point, had Stalin not won out. So Gregory Zinoviev said, in, I believe this was 1919, he said, "We are approaching the complete abolition of money. We are making the wages of labor a payment in kind. We are introducing free trams. We already possess free education, free dinners, even if of a poor quality, free housing, and lighting." And a decree of April 30th, 1920 established that wages were to be paid in kind. And in the same year, Lenin wrote to the Commission for Abolishing Cash Taxes. He wrote, "There is no doubt about switching from money to the exchange of products without money." But he went on to say that it couldn't occur just yet, because first it was necessary to end appropriation of the peasant's surplus and temporarily move to a tax in kind rather than an appropriation. And this was because there were problems with the peasants. They weren't cooperating because they did not enjoy having all of their surpluses seized. And a declaration on February 3rd, 1921 stated the intention to abolish all money payment of taxes. So they were certainly on their way there, and this also led the Soviet government to ignore the effects of their policies that on the currency, on devaluing the currency, because they were intending anyway to abolish money and to move to a moneyless economy, which is part of their utopia. So unsurprisingly, avoiding or ignoring the effect that policies had on money, of course, led to problems with money, the value of the money. So incredible inflation occurred periodically, but then was often followed by a money shortage. And this was possibly because of the destruction of banks and other types of policies, and including doing things in kind. But then the in-kind payments also became just necessary sometimes. So direct distribution and barter replaced money exchange both when it was intended and when there was a lack of currency, and so it was the only way that things could be done. So there were some basic lessons, including the fact that a barter economy is kind of a return to a chaotic barter economy wasn't actually a step towards socialism as it was often made out to be. They sort of learned that this was probably not a positive step on the road to socialism. And they also saw that inequality can continue to persist without money. And also attempts at worker control over money, which was one of their steps on the way to the abolition of money, also caused a lot of problems, including the most obvious one was when they eliminated interest. This led to an incredible increase in the waste of the use of capital, because they were unable to compare different projects, and projects that wouldn't have been able to pay back the loans with interest became, were able to be done anyway, which was one of the things that they were hoping would happen, because they didn't want people to have to defend things with profitability. But then that became very wasteful, this sort of idealistic notion that things should be able to be funded regardless of whether they would create profit. I mean, that can of course happen, but you still need to do cost calculations. You still need to make sure that it's a better use, even if it's, a charitable use, a better charitable use than some other charitable use that reaches the same ends but with more efficient means. So ultimately they had to reintroduce capital charges so that these kinds of calculations could be made. Capital charges, of course, only one part of prices, but it was a very important part and one that they learned quite early. And this ties in with the soft budget constraint that Alec Nove talks about. And he goes into some of the detail, and I go into some of the detail in my book, about the importance of interest or capital charges. So again, it helps you to determine the true costs, or at least more closely to have a little bit of a better chance of determining the true cost. You still might have problems in a socialist economy in terms of determining prices, but the capital charge or interest is a very important part of determining the costs for a comparison between two projects. Also, the interest payment stimulates efficient use of resources and ensures efficient use of resources, because if a company can't pay back, if a project can't pay back the interest, then they won't be able to continue. And when they are able to, when someone is able to earn interest, then they're able to continue to make other kinds of efficient investments, because that can always get put back into to their investment strategy. So Sovietologist Alec Nove on this said that a capital charge has both macro and microeconomic effects, and reminds one that the distinction between these categories is often blurred. And so this is the multiple uses of interest, and why, like other prices in the economy, it has a self-regulation effect. It's self-regulatory and provides efficient macro and micro uses.